So Dr. Francesca Meloni is a lecturer in social justice in the School of Education, Communication and Society, and a core member of our Refugee Mental Health and Place network at King's College London. Her research focuses on contemporary processes of migration and social exclusion. She has a background in anthropology and has conducted really a vast amount of research on undocumented young people and social belonging, access to healthcare and education for undocumented migrants, the transitions into institutional adulthood of unaccompanied minors, and the datafication and hostile migration policies in welfare services. So we're really lucky to have Francesca with us today, who has published also her work in major journals in the social sciences. But today we will hear about her latest book, Ways of Belonging, Undocumented Youth in the Shadow of Illegality, which has been published by Rutgers University Press. And it is in this book that she examines the experiences of undocumented young people who are excluded from K-12 schools in Canada and are in this process rendered invisible to the education system. But I will not give too much away and just hand over to Francesca. So thank you very much for joining us and for Francesca to presenting your book.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to also Zara and Trudy for helping to organize the event. It's really great to see familiar faces, friends and colleagues, and to be here. So without further ado, I will share the PowerPoint, the presentation. Let me share it now. Can you all see it? Okay, wonderful. So yes, so I'd like to present some reflections from my book, Ways of Belonging, Undocumented Youth in the Shadows of Illegality, which is wrapped out with Rutgers University Press. And before starting to present, I'd like to say that, you know, often in book talks and conversations, books are often presented as finished products because we see the book and as arguments, as well-wrapped arguments. And I'd like to think about this book launch and this presentation more as an open conversation, about the book as a result of an ongoing process of thinking and discussing with different communities and different colleagues and friends and, you know, researchers and community organizations. So I feel really lucky to have the opportunity to do this here with you now. And, you know, every time that I do a presentation or a talk or you know, a roundtable about this book, I always come back with, like, you know, new questions and, in a sense, new ways of thinking about some of the issues that I explored in the book. So it would be great just to see how it resonates or not with, you know, different experiences and different contexts. So Hannah has already said a bit what the book is in a nutshell. So yeah, just briefly, you know, it's a book that examines the experiences of undocumented young people who are excluded from schools in Canada. And in Quebec, undocumented young people are not named in the law. They are just invisible, and so schools arbitrarily decide who is entitled to schools and what documents are required. So for undocumented children, there is not a normative systems around access to education. There is no law, there is no clear policies. And so sometimes they are excluded from school altogether, and other times they are unofficially accepted. So what I will do in this presentation, and I will explain a little bit what was the research journey that underpinned the book, that let the book emerge. And then I will discuss two key themes that underpin the book. One is structural invisibility, and the other one is belonging and double binds. And I would like just to conclude with some brief suggestions, a way of thinking about creative approaches of writing and doing ethnography, and then we can leave it to the discussion. So this book originates from 4 years of ethnographic fieldwork in Montreal, Canada. And even if it's a single author book, it really emerged from the experience of working together as part of a bigger team. And in particular of coordinating two wider projects and being involved with other researchers and community organizations. So one was a project on access to healthcare for undocumented children and pregnant women in Canada. And the other one was a working group on access to education in Montreal for undocumented children. And I will talk a little bit more about that just later. And so the young people that I met and that they are also featured in the book are mostly from Caribbean and Latin American countries, from 14 to 12 years old. And so I would like just to spend a little bit of time to just talk about how I conducted the research. And you know, this is something that sometimes it's a hidden part of books, you know, in writings or in book talks and conversations. But I think it's particularly important just to highlight some of the ethical issues that arise, and that they are also important in conducting fieldwork with undocumented groups, or, you know, highly marginalized groups in a context of epistemic violence. So when I started to conduct my study and I started to conduct my PhD, it was 2009. And in Canada, there was little public awareness about the issue of undocumented migration. Often in Canada, there is the idea that Canada is a welcoming and multicultural country, and that the problem of undocumented migration is a problem that concerns only the neighboring country of, you know, the United States. So undocumented migration was not on the public radar, was not much in the media spotlight, and it was an unspoken issue. And so when I started the field work, and I was working as part of this bigger project, getting in contact with undocumented young people were doubly vulnerable because of their young age and because of their undocumented status was challenging at times, but was also impossible many times. And this impossibility and this difficulty in, you know, earning the trust of undocumented young people make me question also my ethical roles and responsibility in this context of social injustice and marginalizations that young people suffered. And when I was actually in Canada, and I don't know if Hannah remembers that, but we had conversations about our respective PhDs, and you know, I was telling about some of the challenges, and Hannah asked me the question, like, you know, do you think is it ethical to document the undocumented? And this is a question that in a sense stayed with me and really like made me questions what was I doing there, and how could I be in that context. And things started to shift when I interviewed with other colleagues some undocumented women about their access to healthcare, and started to volunteer in an organization for undocumented women, who was also part of the advisory board of the bigger research project on access to healthcare. And some of the stories that women told us surprised us. So many undocumented women told us that access to healthcare was not really during their pregnancy was not really very concerning issue for them, but the most troubling thing was access to education for their children. Also was the fact of not being able to secure an education for them. And this was something that the research team didn't plan to study, we weren't even aware that there was an issue. But when we listened to those stories, we then co-established a working group with other researchers and community organizations on access to education for these children. And what we wanted to do with that were different things. So first of all, we wanted to document what was happening on the ground, because nobody knew what were the practices, what were the story of these children, what schools were doing, what was the policy, etc. And then we also helped families with individual cases when they had denied access, so putting in touch with some community organizations who can help. And then after a few months, almost a year, then the working group also decided to involve some institutions in the working group. So there were some school boards, youth protection agencies, and also a representative of the Ministry of Education that joined the group. And the aim there was, to look at different policies, different practices, to put together these different voices and perspective, but also to move towards policy change. So to put really some pressure on the government to make more welcoming policies. And so at that point, many community organizations and young people started to contact me. I was coordinating this working group on access to education, and many community organizations and young people started to contact me, either because they wanted some information or some help with some individual cases of denied access, or because they wanted to share their story. And they thought that the working group was something that was meaningful, something that could also benefit them. And so at that point, my research role became messier. It was not just a pure research role, but I was also involved in action. And I took a clearer ethical stance towards a situation of social injustice that young people and their families suffered. And I could not have done, and I would not have done that field work in that context where that violence was unbearable, without taking that ethical stand and without becoming meaningfully involved into action. And so the book tells the story of this process, and it tries to assemble together these different pieces that compose the puzzle of denied access, right? So the fear of families, the struggles of young people with daily invisibility, the confusion of school boards with the absence of clear guidelines from the ministry, and the ignorance of the Ministry of Education that the issue even exists. And so there is one key theme in the book that is structural invisibility. And this is really how I became to think about how illegalizations and exclusion from school emerged from the work of the working group, emerged from the field work, and from the stories that all the different people from the working group recounted. And so in the book, I define structural invisibility as different norms and practices that the state deliberately leaves ambiguous, silence, half written or whispered, and that they have the consequence of erasing people at the social, legal, and political level. And I would like to emphasize here this deliberately, because this is not an innocent oversight on the part of the state. It is a deliberate strategy to avoid seeing and knowing a particular social problem, and to avoid a particular thorny ethical dilemma and social issue. And I think this invisibility is particularly acute for undocumented children because of their contradictory social status. And so in front of undocumented children and access to, and the question of access to social services and access to education, the state is faced with a paradox. So it is responsible for protecting all children. In Quebec, the Education Act says that all children should have the right to education because they are vulnerable and because they are minors. But then the same state is also committed to secure borders, national frontiers, and to deport children based on their undocumented status, alone or with their parents. And so instead of resolving this ethical tension, the Canadian state, as many other states internationally, often prefers not to speak on the question of access to education for undocumented children. And we can see that the state clearly sees undocumented children when they are detained, when they cross the borders, when they are deported alone or with their parents. So in these traumatic events of displacement, the state clearly sees these children as undocumented. But then it fails to recognize these young people where they're not expected to be. So in their everyday lives, in the classrooms, in their schools, in these everyday places where they become to establish their belongings and their lives in Canada. And so when I was thinking about these issues, I was reading some of the literature, academic literature written about undocumented migration to help think about, how people become illegal in the front of the state, how they are illegalized in this process. And much of the literature has focused on the US context. And in the US context, undocumented migration has a long history. It's very much in the media spotlight and has been also very much legislated, right? So it's in the law, and there are also like clear policies, and including also quite a lot of data about undocumented migrants present in the US territory. And one of the main things that we find is that, this literature is also like emphasized how we need to think about illegality as a socio-political construction that is strategically created by policies and state practices, right? So in a sense, the law marks people as illegal, it makes them illegal, and then in turn, this labeling as illegal creates this underclass of exploitable, racialized people who can then respond to labor demands and, for instance, do menial and exploited jobs, picking fruits in farms, etc. And so, for instance, Nicolas de Genova, in a famous article about illegalities, he said that illegalities are constituted or regimented by the law, directly, explicitly, in a manner that presume to be more or less definitive, albeit not without manifold ambiguities and indeterminacies, always manipulable in practice. So here again, the core concept is how illegalities are constituted and governed by the law in a definitive way. If you look at the context of Canada, and I think it's similar to to the context of other countries internationally, the making of illegality is quite ambiguous and uncertain in more uncertain and ambiguous way, like as compared to the US context. So in Canada, people become illegal not by unauthorized entry, not by crossing the borders without without legal status, but they do become, but they often cross the borders with a legal status. So they have sometimes, you know, they are asylum seekers, they have a visitor visa, they are students, and then they fall out of status. And some scholars have advocated for the use of precarious legal status instead of undocumented status in Canada to really capture these, you know, these multiple forms of legal and non-legal statuses that happen in Canada and that make people precarious, and they are attached to a limited access to services. So people can really move along a spectrum of different precarious legal status and legal uncertainty that can lead to deportation, that can lead to destitutions and a limited access to welfare services. And so to understand how undocumented young people and families in Canada then become undocumented and become illegalized, we cannot rely on the simple idea of illegality as a definitive construction, that it's explicitly or implicitly regimented by the law. And I think we need to take seriously what de Genova in the previous quote puts into parentheses. So we need to take seriously into consideration these manifold ambiguities and indeterminacies, always manipulable in practices. And it is these ambiguities and indeterminacies of the law, as well as the leeway of the state agents within those ambiguities, that remain quite under-theorized in the literature. And I would like to say that this concept of structural invisibility is not just a pretty, you know, theoretical or analytical concept. It is something that came up from the fieldwork. It came up from all the stories that they were recounted by undocumented families, young people, and institutional subjects, as you know, as the work of the working group unfolded. And so for families and young people, this invisibility translated into a chronic anxiety and uncertainty. They often moved address, moved house, removed children from schools, and their lives were constantly shaped by the movements of hiding and running for fear of being deported. When there was a threat of deportation, then families would move again for fear of being caught by the authorities. And for young people, this invisibility meant that they had to quickly learn how to become invisible students in their everyday life. Their invisibility was also very tangible. It translated into a lack of an official code by the Ministry of Education, because these children didn't exist as an administrative category in the law. They were not named in the law. So even when they were accepted in schools, they were not officially accepted as such. They lacked a diploma, and even if they studied all those years in education, they couldn't be issued a final diploma, because it was as if they were invisible all those years in education. And in their everyday lives, people didn't disclose their status to anyone, and they didn't disclose their situation to anyone, and sometimes even to their closest friends in schools and outside schools. And so their everyday presence was always haunted by an absence, their own deportability, and the fear of being constantly misrecognized by others. And this is, for instance, what Roberto, a young person from Mexico, told me when he knew about the deportation order that his family received. And he told me, when I feel sad, I don't speak of this with my friends. I take my time. I don't have to talk of this because I'm afraid that they will say that I have to leave, and that they will say that it would be good if I left. Things like that. I'm afraid they're going to laugh at me, that they're not going to understand my situation. And for many teachers who have children and young people like Roberto in the schools, the recognizing the struggles and the misrecognition that these young people suffered was very difficult. Many teachers, most of the teachers, like took for granted that undocumented children couldn't go to school because they didn't have documents and because they weren't allowed. Some of them perhaps sensed that there was something that they called like a fuzzy status, something maybe complicated about their circumstances, but they didn't really ask further question, and they didn't really inquire any further. And school boards in the meetings of the working group shared often that they struggled with the opacity and on policy. For them, the invisibility and the issue of undocumented migration and undocumented children was very much present, was very much real, as in terms of a burden, in terms of deciding who was entitled to access and what documents were required, and in terms of also a financial burden. And so, for instance, Paul was a director of one of the main school boards in Montreal, said in one of the meetings, in one of the meetings of the working group, there is a juridical void for undocumented children. We need rules that they are really clear because the law is not clear. And interestingly, in the high room of the Ministry of Education, the issue didn't exist at all. So, for instance, in our meetings, a representative of the Ministry of Education joined the group and actively participated. And he was genuinely surprised when he was faced and confronted with the reality of undocumented migration on the part of community organizations and school boards. And he said, you know, we have never perceived this situation as real. So if at the level of the law, these children were not named, the Ministry of Education didn't possibly know that these children existed, and these children were a reality for many schools and many school boards. And so what is the contribution, or what can structural invisibility help us understand, and how can it be applied in other contexts? And so the Canadian case can help us to uncover some of the silences and ambiguities of the law. So not just how law makes people illegal, and how you know, the state knows certain things, but also how the state ignores certain things, right? Avoids to see, avoids to name, and how this denial of seeing, denial of naming is also a deliberate strategy on the part of the state. So it can help us it can help us to focus our attention to the way that the state and the policies can be spectral, so they can make people gaslight. And through the denial of seeing and the deliberate erasure of people from the legal system, the state can repress unresolved social dilemma, like, for instance, the ethical dilemma of what to do with undocumented children and their access to education. And so so as a result, the state denied recognition to particular and specific racialized group of people within society. And so more widely, structural invisibility not only relates to the plight of undocumented young people and families, but also to wider processes of marginalizations and racializations of groups of people, that they are cast out of society, they are erased in a legal and social void. And this is, for instance, the book cover of a famous book, Invisible Men, by Ralph Allison. And it's a book that is also, it's been quite important in sociological thinking, and it has been written by Ralph Allison in the 50s to describe the situation and the condition of invisibility of African American people in the segregated South. And so the second part of the book interrogates these questions about belonging, right? So one of the things that the book asks is how this structural invisibility, how does this structural invisibility and how does illegality shape the everyday lives of young people? How does it enter the ways that young people establish their sense of belonging in Canada? So for instance, how do young people create a sense of belonging and navigate their everyday relationships when they have to hide themselves and their legal status, even to their closest friends? What happens when, to their sense of belonging when they might be separated from their friends and from their loved ones because of deportation? And a recurring pattern in the stories of young people was a pattern and a thread of ambivalence, of ambivalence and double binds. And this ambivalence shaped deeply the affective relationships that young people created in Canada. And there are two reasons for this ambivalence. One is the most obvious one, is that young people could not fully belong simply because the state failed to recognize them, right? Failed to recognize them through immigration policies, racist immigration policies, through the ambivalent attitudes of teachers who failed to recognize them as in their classroom, and through the practices of school administrations. But then second, I think young people also responded to this misrecognition by deliberately masking their identity and ambivalently positioning themselves in relation to other. So there was an everyday gesture of hiding their status from their teachers, their classmates, even their closest friends in their everyday lives. So to the people they loved, they camouflaged their identity, they tried to blend in. And there was always the possibility that their friends would turn their back and say, you're not one of us, we don't love you anymore. As Roberto said in that quote, he was afraid that people would laugh at him, right? And said, you need to go back to your country. It's good that you're going to be deported. And, when we talk about undocumented young people and migrant young people in general, in academic literature, but also in advocacy discourses, sometimes the narratives and the way we talked about young people are often polarized. So, on the one hand, there is sometimes the story that these young people are vulnerable. And so we emphasize their suffering, their social suffering, because as a result of hostile migration policies, as a result of racism, as a result of different restrictions and lack of access to social services. And on the other hand, sometimes they are there is a narration, a narrative, and often enthusiastic about young people and migrant communities as political subjects that they resist the structural constraint, that they resist hostile policies, and so there is also an emphasis, for instance, on collective movements of resistance. And so as scholars and as advocates and as people concerned for issues of social justice, I think we often mobilize individual stories as structural stories. So they are not just the story of, these individual persons, but they also represent and they mean to, symbolize or to recount something that is like, part of a broader pattern. And these stories serve to denounce the exploitative logic of deportation and surveillance, right? And we see that also in journalist accounts of, migrant narratives. And I do understand, this drive, and I also share some of these concerns. But sometimes this approach might also reproduce some of the some of these myths, some of these fantasies that we also try to avoid and critique. So, the fact that national boundaries are set and that citizenship is singular or complete. Sometimes the risk is that implicitly or explicitly, like we keep asking, these questions about integration. So whether young people belong or do not belong, as if they are two clear alternatives and definitive states of being, that they are always defined in the terms of the state, in the terms of the most powerful. And so my effort in the book was to try to open ways for a more nuanced examination of psychological dynamics and examination of how subjects claim a sense of belonging and carry on like their lives beyond these two polarized narratives, right? And beyond also movements of collective resistance. And so, for instance, some of the questions that I ask are, how do young people dream? What do young people dream in moments of respite when they feel free and love? Or how do they make conflicting realities coexist together? And I would like to reflect on this question by presenting the story and images of Elizabeth, who is a young undocumented person living in Canada. And then I would like to conclude with 3 potential directions and suggestions. And so I would like to start with Elizabeth's nightmare. And so every night over the 10 years that Elizabeth has lived without legal status in the US and Canada, Elizabeth had a recurring nightmare. And she said, in my dreams, I always run from immigration. I was naked, cold, and vulnerable. And so as she ran through the streets, she heard immigration officers shooting at their backs, their dogs barking in the distance. And Elizabeth tried to hide in the bushes and in the woods, but night after night, the officers found and arrested her. So every single night over these 10 years, Elizabeth had this terrifying dream, and there was the same ending, the police officers that found her and arrested her. And this dream resonated with the traumatic experiences that Elizabeth experienced during the migration journey. So she left Colombia when she was 12 years old and started a long journey on the van alone as an unaccompanied minor. So she crossed Central America and then Mexico before arriving to the United States. And at the US-Mexican border, in the dark, she ran from immigration. She hid in the bushes and in the woods. And then she thought at one point that she was safe, that the officers had not found her, but then she was caught and immigration authorities send her on a plane to a youth detention center in Texas. So Elizabeth said that in her dreams, she experienced again and again, night after night, what she defined the dark sides of being illegal, what it is to fear, to hide, to feel alone and isolated about everything. So for a long time, her life was shaped by this constant movement of hiding and running, because there were no places that they were safe, no places to call home, nowhere to stay, but only places to run from. And she said, I never felt safe. By being illegal, you're a target, so you're easily hurt. Anything can happen to you when you're not allowed to live in a country and you do not have ID. You do not have the same right as everybody else. So you live a life where you do not feel like you're in charge of your life. So you feel obliged to hide or to run, because that is the way it is. And so what Elizabeth calls the dark sides of what it is, like being illegal, evokes what other scholars have described as the embodied consequence of illegality. So how illegality and undocumented status shapes and profoundly enters the bodies of people, the trauma, it enters their dreams, it enters their nightmares. But also as I started to befriend young people and families, as I listened to their stories, I also realized that marginalizations and illegality were never unilaterally imposed. And so there were moments, sometimes of respite, however temporary they were, where young people could carry on, negotiate, and sometimes imagine life as it could be otherwise. So they endure uncertainty and found these fragments of moments of respite in fragments of imaginations and intimate connections where life could be imagined as if otherwise. And again, here, I think we can better understand this complex predicament through the beautiful photographs that Elizabeth took about her nightmares. So Elizabeth had a series of black and white pictures where she reinterpreted her nightmares. And in those pictures, she transferred her experience to the body of Rodrigo. Rodrigo was a close friend of hers who was living also without legal status. He came from Mexico and he was one of her best friends. And a few years after the pictures were taken, he was deported back to Mexico, and Elizabeth lost contact with him after deportation. And in these images, we see Rodrigo naked as Elizabeth was in her dreams. He's often partially hidden from our gaze. We can only see his back. So for instance, here in this picture, we can see him on this track of an abandoned railway. Is like bending down, his arm over his head, as if to protect himself. There are other pictures where we see him in front of a broken window or walking in desolated, empty urban landscapes. And then there is a series of other black and white pictures where Rodrigo is there, naked as well. We can only see his back, but we can see him in white natural spaces. So for instance, here in one picture, he opens his arms, embracing the line between the sea and the sky. Or we find him in front of a wheat field. He waves his arm, the spikes dancing in the wind. And so Elizabeth photographs that they are a refraction of her own nightmares, represent her life by shaped as vulnerability. There are abandoned urban corners where one is stuck on the ground, you know, and on the track of a railway, and friends might be separated forever. But they also illuminate openings of potentiality. So there is sometimes a sea, a wheat field, where new possibilities of life still exist. And so when I was writing the book, I often questioned and I struggled with how do I make justice to these double binds and, you know, these complexities and these contradictions that shapes Elizabeth's lives and other young people's lives. So how do I write about these complexities and these nuances and the coexistence of vulnerability and agency? And these questions occupied my mind as I was writing the book, and I don't think I entirely resolved these questions. And perhaps this is something also that we can discuss in this, today. But I suggest 3 things that open for me like new ways of thinking and help me, write about some of the stories of young people. So I would like to suggest 3 approaches. And so first of all, I think the failure to understand Elizabeth's complex position relate more broadly to our own difficulty to recognize the coexistence of vulnerability and agency in young people's lives. But we often fail to recognize the coexistence of vulnerability and agency in our lives. So we tend to numb and flatten contradictions in the process of evaluating and judging human actions or describing, behaviors in people's lives. And so I do suggest that in the ways that we can understand the stories and experiences of young people, we do not need to necessarily resolve the ambiguities and contradictions that shape their lives. And we can take a middle path and even get lost on the ways. We can just like keep these ambiguities and these contradictions as part of more complex stories. And when I was looking also for some inspirations about, other texts and works that recount and keep these contradictions open, I found inspiration in a collection of images and text called After the Last Sky by Edward Said and the photographer John Moore. And this is a book that combines text and photographs about Palestinian lives and depicts many images that they are very distant from the images of destruction and genocidal violence that we now see in Gaza. And in the book, we see people playing cards, for instance, in an opening cafe under the trees, people raising children, cooking meals, people discussing on a terrace with a lovely view of the city. And Edward Said described this book as an attempt to render the condition of exile, not from the viewpoint of policymakers, but that of memoirists and unregimented historians. It is an unreconciled book in which the contradictions and antinomies of our lives and experiences remain as they are, assemble neither, I hope, into neat wholes, nor into sentimental ruminations about the past. Fragments, memories, disjointed scenes, intimate particulars. And so in similar ways, I think we can understand the life of Elizabeth and many other young people, not only as a structural stories, focusing on what interests policymakers the most. And often, there is a lot of policy-driven research that tends to let emerge these structural stories. But I think we can also make justice to these fragments, memories, disjointed scenes intimate particular. We can make justice to the tension and open-ended spaces that shape young people's everyday lives and imagination. And this point also leads to how we render these complexities and these ambiguities. And I think it is telling that the book by Edward Said and Jean Moore also combined text and images to render these fragments and these complexities. And so often I think, there is a need to, this means also like using different forms of visual methods and approaches in research and also in writing. So sometimes simply interviewing people can reproduce the dangers and the violence of a single story, that same stories that asylum seekers are forced to repeat again and again for the asylum claim. And so I suggest that the use of images, poetry, and other creative means are important to keep these spaces and to make justice to young people's stories. And this is not because images tell more than 1,000 words, because I don't think they do, but it's because images and poetic writing can match the opacity and ambiguity of our feelings. So what happens when we see an image is that, it can evoke different contradictory feelings, different, more ambiguous experiences without entirely resolving them. These experiences exist in an image, in a poem, without tensions. And so they can open up different spaces for imagination, narration, and reflection. And so lastly, and I conclude here, I also suggest that sensitive and meaningful research also needs to involve migrant community and young peoples themselves, and especially in contexts of social exclusion, where the violence and the silence of the status quo is sometimes unbearable. And so we need to question the ethical responsibilities and the ways to do ethical research in these spaces and our roles within it. And so I would like to understand this kind of participatory and engaged research, or research that is more meaningfully engaged in action, not as a space where we grant visibility and voice to people, but as an ethical space in between, where we can redefine research priorities and questions and the focus, and we can create different spaces to listen for people's stories beyond simple frameworks of suffering and compassion, but we can also make spaces for different, more intimate stories. And we can keep a sense of humility in how we create knowledge together. And so I would like to thank everyone for listening, for being here. And I'm closing here, and I open the floor for the discussion, and I very much welcome the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Francesca. This was just a really wonderful and rich presentation. So wonderful to listen to you, to learn from you, and I can see lots of claps from people in the reactions.